Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Stuart. I hope you won't be offended if, as I peer into these rather bright lights, I observe that most of the people in the room, like me, are middle-aged. Shame, I know. Some might even be pushing out of that phase of life. But I think that we, as the middle-aged of this world, have a particularly important responsibility. We have a responsibility to look back at our own path through life, not yet complete, but nevertheless pretty well trodden, and then look at the path through life that we are presenting to the next generation and what we are doing to help them make the most of it. And I look back at my own life and I observe that it was pretty straightforward for a lot of people in my generation. It's certainly pretty straightforward for me. At school, I think I only did 8 O-levels. The idea of doing 10 or 11 was completely unheard of. And I, broadly speaking, did the subjects that I was interested in that, I seemed to be pretty good at. I did A-levels. I don't seem to remember having any conversation with anyone about what those A-levels were going to take me towards, what avenues would open up as a result of them. And I went to university, which frankly seemed pretty much like another school, just one where you were allowed to drink. The government paid for it. There had many fewer lessons than there were at school. But in every other way, it was just a sort of path you went down because people told you it was probably a good idea and work seemed like it was going to be pretty hard. So you carry on studying for a few more years. Now let's look at the generation currently growing up. What is the future that they face? Well, firstly, they're going to be working, probably, for about 50 years. If pensions still exist, they're not going to be coming until they're well into their 70s, I suspect. And what are we asking them to do in those very early years while they're at school? Well, in their late teens, we're asking them to make a major investment decision. We're asking them to make a choice, whether they are going to take on tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt to make an investment in their own education at university, or whether they're going to take another path through life. And that is a decision of enormous consequence. It's a decision that none of us in this room had to make until we were, thinking about buying that first property in our late 20s or 30s. And even earlier than the late teens, we're asking them to make choices about courses that will categorically close or open doors that will affect them for the rest of their lives. So we have a profound responsibility as the people who created the world in which these youngsters are growing up. We have a profound responsibility to help them through it. And that responsibility is not a responsibility simply to try and make it easy for them. The first responsibility, I believe, is to tell them the truth. No soft soap, no easy lines. Tell them the truth. And the first and most important truth is that while when we were growing up, there were jobs, quite a lot of jobs, not great jobs, not well-paid jobs, but there were jobs where a command of written and spoken English and maths was not necessary. There are vanishingly few of those jobs now. And in 20 years' time, I fully predict there will be none. There will not be a job that does not require basic command of maths and written and spoken English. And we need to tell them that, and we need to be honest with them about that, and we need to help them acquire those skills. So that is why, consistently, for the last few years, we have been placing an emphasis on continuing study of English and maths. But of course, all of the questions are then begged. How does that study take place? What qualifications are they aiming towards? And I know that many of you are working on this and are trying to think of new ways to engage people who have not been engaged in the traditional teaching of GCSE English and Maths at school, to engage them in acquiring those skills through other means. And I think we'd simply say to the people in this room this, is that frankly we're not innovating enough in this area yet. It is not going to work for us to just say, you've been through however many years of English and Maths classes at school, and it didn't really work for you, and so we're now going to make you take a whole lot more classes that were going to be pretty much exactly the same, and we're going to expect to get a different result. I'm sure there will be some people who missed a grade pretty closely and who will, on a second go, sail through it. Brilliant. Couldn't be happier. But the idea that most of the people who fail to get a C in GCSE English and Maths are going to get a C by being taught the same way, the same curriculum towards the same exam, I think that that is to delude ourselves. And that is why I'm so very keen to look at the functional skills qualification, to look at how we can make it more consistent, to give it a greater brand value, a greater credibility and reputation out there in the world of employers, and to ensure that there are two routes to that vital command of English and Maths, that there are two routes that command respect in the workplace and pride at home for young people. The second responsibility we have with this generation that is currently growing up is to challenge them, to stretch them, and not to mollycoddle them. And that is why I believe that the government was so right to do a very dramatic thing of cancelling a huge raft of qualifications that might have been quite fun to do, and let's be honest, may have in some cases been rather easier and cheaper to teach, but which actually provided very little value to the young people taking them. I do not believe it helps anyone to get them to pass an exam with flying colours which has no value out there in the real world. We need to emphasise qualifications that employers value. We've made a huge amount of progress in that direction, but I just think we all need to be clear with ourselves that that is a constant work in progress. It's not a one-off clear out of the slightly less valuable qualifications. It is a constant process of asking ourselves, does this qualification, which may well 5 years ago have had a value, does it still have a value? Do people still employ people who have got it? Do still people look for it on a CV? And if they don't, we need to be ruthless about winnowing it out so that we can be guiding young people towards choices that will truly help them in that path through life. And that leads me to the third profound responsibility that we have towards these young people. It's to guide them, to steer them, not to leave them stumbling around in the dark without adequate information on which to make the choices about their future lives. And that's why, as a government, we accept that we have much more to do on careers advice. We have no regrets about getting rid of Connections because there was no evidence that Connections was providing that vital source of advice and guidance to the young people who need it. But we do recognise that what has been put in place since then is patchy. It is good in places, is good in some institutions, but it is not consistent and it is not sufficiently open, porous, independent and impartial. So we are determined to build on the guidance that we've given Ofsted, to build on the new elements in the National Careers Service contracts to focus on providing careers advice to young people, but not to stop there, to go further in ensuring that every school has a responsibility, understands its responsibility, and is actually helped to fulfill its responsibility, not just to encourage young people to join its sixth form, though that will be the right answer for many, but also to consider all of the other options that are open to them so that they can make the best choices for their future lives. Now, the strange thing happened to me on the way up here. I came on the train from Euston, and it was quite early in the morning, and I'm not very good early in the morning, I have to tell you. And I sat down in my seat on the train, and somebody sat opposite me, and it's the guy who lives in the flat opposite me in Camberwell in London. We'd booked these seats opposite each other, entirely coincidentally. And he asked me why I was coming to Birmingham. He was coming to some conference on solar energy over at the NEC, and I told him I was coming to speak to you. And he's somebody I've spoken to many times, but I've never spoken to him about his path through life, because you sort of don't necessarily with your neighbour on the corridor. And he said that he left school at 16, and he went and did an apprenticeship at BMW in electrical engineering. And he did that, and then he actually decided he was really interested in engineering, and he went and did a degree in engineering after his 3-year apprenticeship. And then he actually went and did a master's degree in engineering, and he's now running a very successful consultancy helping install new solar energy plants around the country. And I just thought, that is the kind of choice that we need to make sure that every young person, whatever their GCSEs, whatever their A-levels, whatever their parentage, whatever the parental expectations, that every young person knows is out there, is a great choice, and could work for them. That there is not one route through life, and that there is no fork either. That if you choose not to do A-levels, that doesn't mean that you can't come back to an academic career or an academic study at university. That if you choose to do an apprenticeship, it does not mean that you can't get a master's degree. I believe that they're just beginning to break this old idea that an apprenticeship was a young fella under a bonnet mending something. Now, that is always going to be an important skill for society. I certainly will never have it, and we will rely on it. But it is not the whole story about apprenticeships, and it is not what the future of apprenticeships offers our young people. So for me, in the very short time remaining as minister before the next election, if I have one goal, it is to do whatever I can to persuade 3 groups of people about the importance of apprenticeships and the variety of apprenticeships and the quality of the opportunities they create. The first group, of course, is young people, because many of them, I think, form their attitudes based on what their parents tell them and what their teachers tell them, and neither of those groups, however admirable in their intents, neither of them necessarily will have an up-to-date picture of what apprenticeships are. The second group is those parents, because when you talk to apprentices, many of them will say that the biggest hurdle they had to cross was to persuade their mum and dad that it was great that they were doing an apprenticeship, that they could be proud of the fact that their child was doing an apprenticeship, and that it wasn't somehow an abdication of ambition that they weren't going to university. And then the third group, and here I need your help as much as anywhere else, is employers. Almost every employer that does apprenticeships thinks they're fantastic, carries on doing them, does more and more of them every year. But they're still a tiny percentage. We don't need 10% or 15% of employers doing apprenticeships. We need 40% and 50% and 60%. And that is the really important challenge that the Prime Minister has set me in his conference speech. It's not so much the headline number of 3 million, though it's always good to have something that makes your stomach turn slightly as a challenge. But it's the idea that there should be a simple guidance given to every young person. University is a great route to go down for many of you. If you're not going to university, then an apprenticeship is a great route for most of the rest of you. But that we do really, really want you to think very hard about one of those two options. We want you to understand that those are the two gold-plated, gold-standard routes through life, and that this government will do everything in our power to help you go down that route. So those are our responsibilities. Tell the truth. Do not soft soap them. Challenge and stretch. Do not mollycoddle them. Guide and steer. Do not leave them stumbling in the dark. They're not going to have a life as straightforward as that many of us in this room have enjoyed. They're going to make many more changes. The world is going to change around them much, much faster. They'll probably have 3 or 4 or 5 different careers. But if we fulfill those 3 responsibilities, we together in this room, then I think that we can feel confident that the young people growing up today will get to our age and thank us. Thank you very much indeed.
Do you want me to do some questions? Take a couple of questions. Take it from you. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. And I'm sure that resonates very strongly with many people in the room. Really appreciate your views on that. But I would like to take an opportunity to take some questions. So get those questions ready, if you like. One of the things that you raised is that link between careers, qualifications and apprenticeships. Would it be possible to give a quick overview of where you see the current reforms and proposals whilst people get their questions together?
So for firstly on careers, it is tricky. I think we all have to recognise that it's tricky. It's one of the things I find interesting is that in many areas of policy, you can say, well, if only we did it like in Finland, Singapore, pick a country. But there are always certain countries that people point to as exemplars. I have not yet found a single place where anybody thinks careers advice and guidance is done well according to a model that we can somehow replicate. And I find that very interesting because I think it tends to suggest that it's a fundamentally quite a tricky thing to get right. Plus also, it's changed so much in terms of what good would look like that actually there probably aren't very many inherited models from the past that we can copy. But I do think that we need to find a way to get employers into schools in a constant way, not in an episodic way, and into all schools, not just into some forward-thinking, outward-looking schools. And that, in a sense, is the focus of the work that we're doing. You may have seen Lord Young did a report for the Prime Minister in which he talked about the potential role for local economic partnerships and the idea of enterprise advisors being linked to every school. I think that is a very interesting idea. I think that you've got to imagine you're the head teacher in a school and you've got 1,000,001 things to worry about, and somebody writes to you about some careers resource, some website, or some local employer writes to you and says that they'd like to come in and do some presentations to students. You don't currently have anybody to send it to, oftentimes, unless you're lucky enough to have a governor or somebody who is a local business person. So the idea of giving school heads a resource that is implanted and embedded in the local business community, I think is a good one, and it's something we're looking closely at. But we're not yet at the point where we can make an announcement about exactly how we want to add to this service.
And you'll notice from our manifesto, Minister, that we believe training providers could be one of those links between schools. We're working with lots of schools and with lots of employers. We could be one of those links. So
I'd welcome it.
Any questions? Simon, do you want to take the first question?
Simon Page from WS Training in Ipswich. You came and saw us last week. Thank you. As I'm sure you're aware, there is much concern from employers about the requirement for cash contributions for future apprenticeships. Can you provide us with an update on how you stand on the impact this may have on future apprenticeship numbers?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a question that I've been looking at pretty closely. We're currently doing a pilot, as you know, of the first Trailblazers, and in that pilot there is a required cash contribution. And I think we're right to pilot that and right to look at how that works. On the other hand, I think that we should all be honest and observe that the employers who are involved in delivering the apprenticeships under that pilot are employers of a particular kind, a particular depth of resource, and the apprenticeships involved are a particular kind of apprenticeships. They're not necessarily absolutely typical of apprenticeships. I think I'd like to be clear. I would like every employer who is creating an apprenticeship to want to dig into their pockets to contribute in cash, as well as in all of the other million ways that employers do contribute when they take on an apprentice, towards the success of that program. I absolutely would love that to happen. The question is, do you require it? I am nervous, I think, about the effect, particularly on all of those employers who do not currently do apprenticeships. I'm nervous about the idea of an obligation to put in cash. So I'm looking very closely at it. I used to run a manufacturing business. I wasn't very good at it, but I did spend about 5 years doing it. So I have quite a lot of experience of employing people in a whole range of manufacturing and engineering jobs. And I just remember the amount of time and energy and distraction that was involved every time you took on somebody who, however bright and motivated, was young and unformed and ill-experienced. The amount of supervision time, the amount of sort of health and safety time, the amount of time that you had to slow down the machines so that you could actually train them in the particular operation of that machine, and the production that you lost as a result of that. You know, we should never underestimate the contribution that employers are making when they create an apprenticeship, even if they never write a cheque for a single pound. And so I'm very aware of that, and I am looking very closely at how we should learn from the lessons of the pilot.
I think people really welcome that statement. And just to reinforce our commitment, I can assure you everybody in this room is out there every day trying to get every penny from every employer, because we know the contribution that the government makes does not pay for a high quality apprenticeship. But the belief in a co-investment rather than co-cash is something that we hold very strongly. But you've got our commitment to getting every employer to make a contribution.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm Ben Rowland from Arch. You met some of our apprentices at Google recently. Yes. I just wondered why you mentioned the three groups that need to be persuaded about the value of apprenticeships. I just wondered why teachers was not included in that list.
No reason other than the fact that 3 is always better than 4. You're absolutely right. Of course you're right. I do think that we need to be careful, in a sense, as a community, not to criticise teachers for not being able to talk in a fresh and relevant way about apprenticeships. Because bluntly, most of us talk from our own experience. It takes a major effort of will and of understanding to actually talk about something of which we have no experience. And by definition, almost all teachers have been down the route of university and then going into teaching. So it is hard to do that. So I think you're absolutely right. And it is clearly a big source of advice for young people. And so we need to make sure that they do understand what this route means. But I think that critically, we need to make sure that the getting into schools are people who genuinely have that experience. You know, like the fellow who I bumped into on the train. If we could get him to go back to his school and say, you know, I'm 30, this is my life, and this is how I got there, that will have more value than any number of presentations by any number of teachers on the theoretical value of apprenticeships.
I'm really conscious of the Minister's time, but we'll take one, maybe possibly 2 more.
Thank you. Minister, my name is Richard Katz from the British Glass Manufacturers Confederation. We represent the glass industry, glass manufacturing industry. Glad to hear that you come from a manufacturing background. You started off your presentation in relationship to functional skills as being an essential element that you wish to see coming back for those who unfortunately have not achieved it the first time round. Can you give us some ideas as to how you would imagine achieving this, please?
Well, specifically what we've done is that we've asked Ofqual, which was already conducting a review of functional skills, we've asked them to look specifically at the two questions of, one, how to make the standard of them more consistent and therefore more reliable. Because if you think about it, ultimately a qualification is a currency. And currencies only acquire value if we all believe that they have value. And we all have to have the same consistent expectations of what that thing is worth for it to have that value. So we need to create some consistency in the qualification. I also think that once you've sort of got that right, you then can think about the branding of it. Because I have, and this may be a prejudice and I may be wrong, but my sense is that if you come home and you say, Mum, I got my functional skills qualification, she's going to look a bit baffled and not necessarily jump for joy. Whereas if you come home and say, I got my, fill the space, in English or in maths, then maybe that you will get a different response. I heard something very interesting last night. I was having drinks with a few college principals, including the principal of the college in Exeter, who's the president or chairman or whatever it is of the AOC. And he was saying that even before his time, he remembers that there was an O-level in commercial maths, which was trying to do something similar to what we're now trying to do with more contextual teaching of English and maths through functional skills. So I think the idea of a brand that people can recognise is an important part of it. We have to create it, and you mustn't put the cart before the horse. There's no point coming up with a jazzy brand and then having very inconsistent quality that nobody really can rely on. Got to have that first, and then the brand might begin to gather some momentum.
Thank you. And I take Chairman's privilege for one last question, because it was asked before the conference. In some of your statements around cash contributions and being concerned, as you are, to make sure there's no barriers to SMEs, you seem to come out very strongly on, but the money has to go through employers. And our position has always been employers have to have all of the purchasing decisions, many of which they frankly have today. Do you have a view why the pound notes flowing through employers is so different from employers having the purchasing decisions as choosing who to spend it with, where to spend it and what to spend it on?
I understand the argument. Frankly, people who are a lot cleverer than me and have a lot longer experience of this have advised us very strongly that makes a difference. And I think, instinctively, I'm afraid it does make a difference. Again, from my own business background. If basically you're spending somebody else's money and that money has never hit your account, it's a sort of passive approach. They'll write to you and they say, we recommend you do this, and we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you. Please sign at the bottom if you're happy to go along with it. And that is a much less active ownership and control of what happens with the taxpayers' money than if you have got it. I also want to very strongly encourage more companies to ask themselves, and I'm very keen on group training agencies and other intermediaries that can take on this role for smaller employers, but I want them to ask themselves, is there another way? Could we do this in-house? Could we, set up as an industry a small training agency that will do it for us? I want them to be permanently, every year, asking themselves, is this the best possible way of doing it? I just think that's less likely if they don't actually have the money coming to them.
I understand your
I know you're
position.
going to disagree, but that's why.
The positive part about that is our whole issue is around employers making that decision.
Yeah.
So our view is they shouldn't be allowed to do you can do that for me, unless they've been through a very proactive, positive decision. And we've done a very good job of hiding that for many years. And it's come back and bitten us. Yep. We've done such a good job of making employers get involved and driving that system, so we've got a way to go, whichever way we go. But I think it's been fantastic to hear directly from the Minister. We shouldn't bite into any more of his time, so can I ask you once more to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.